Good evening, everyone. On behalf of all my colleagues and the chief of our division, Yoram Bitton, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to Ambassador Narek Mukherjian, members of the clergy, and the Armenian American community who's really come out here tonight, and all our distinguished guests to the Library of Congress and the African and Middle Eastern Division. I am Joan Weeks, the head librarian of the Near East section. And before we start the program, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our collections and services here at the library. The African and Middle Eastern Division serves as the major research center and houses collections in over 33 vernacular languages from 77 countries in Africa, the Middle East, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, with our 3 sections. The African section covers the countries of sub-Saharan Africa, and the Africana collections of the Library of Congress include materials produced over the centuries by peoples living in sub-Saharan Africa and by others inspired by the continent. The Hebraic sections covers Judaic and Jewish studies worldwide, and the collections include works in Hebrew, Yiddish, Ladino, Judo-Persian, Judo-Arabic, Aramaic, Syriac. The section's holdings are especially strong in the areas of the Bible and rabbinics, liturgy, Hebrew language and literature, Responsa, and Jewish history. And the Near East section covers the Arabic-speaking countries of North Africa, the Middle East, Armenia, Georgia, the Caucasus, as well as the Turkic and Iranic-speaking countries in Central Asia. We go all the way to Afghanistan. And with that, I would like to invite all of you to come to the African and Middle Eastern Reading Room. It's up here on the 2nd floor of the Jefferson Building, and use our Armenian and Georgian collections for your research. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening's program, our Armenian American Heritage at 250. Dr. Khatchig Mouradian is the Armenian and Georgian specialist at the Library of Congress African and Middle Eastern Division. In that role, he has greatly expanded the discovery and access to the Armenian collectors through his briefings for Armenian ministers, scholars, graduate students, and young student groups, with his displays of rare manuscripts, including the Armenian hymnals, Bibles, maps, newspapers, and the digitized Armenian rarities collections. He has greatly expanded the Armenian collections through actively engaging donors and recommending very unique and rare items for the acquisitions. He is a historian of late Ottoman Empire in the modern Middle East. He's the author of the award-winning book, The Resistance Network, published in 2021, and the I.B. Tar's Handbook of Late Ottoman Empire, History and Legacy, published in 2025. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Dr. Khatchig Mouradian for the nice
talk. What we're going to be doing today is embark on a journey across 250 years, in fact, more than 250 years of Armenian presence in what will eventually become the United States and then in the United States. This is not a lecture about the history of Armenian Americans. This is not a lecture about the immigrant experience per se. It is rather a journey across this time period that I'm talking about through the Library of Congress's collection. So it's a little bit of an introduction to the materials that we have at the Library of Congress. Almost every single item that I'm going to be talking about is from our collections here. I would like to thank our colleagues from other divisions. The African Middle Eastern Division was already mentioned, but we have colleagues here from the manuscript division, geography and maps, and you have already seen some of the items featured from those collections. So the Armenian materials at the library span all 24 different reading rooms, collections that we have here at the library. In March 1948, Librarian of Congress Luther Evans wrote to a committee of Armenian Americans who were working to enrich the library's Armenian collections. His words give us a fitting point of departure for tonight's journey. I'm very much impressed by this action on the part of a group of Americans of Armenian ancestry, he wrote. I can think of few activities more appropriate than that they should initiate and support a program for collecting in the Library of Congress materials for the study of the history and culture of the land of their origin. The Librarian of Congress was talking about a small committee of Armenian Americans, primarily living in Washington, D.C., who came together to collect items of importance to Armenian culture and Armenian heritage and to donate to the Library of Congress, as well as to participate in the process of cataloging that collection. This is immediately after World War II. At that point, the library did not have an Armenian cataloger. So tonight, we will trace the realization of that vision through the library's collections. The objects before us will take us across centuries, from Armenian encounters with America in books and maps, to the first documented Armenian presence in colonial Virginia, to the migrations that carried students, workers, refugees, and survivors across the Atlantic and Pacific, to the formation of thriving Armenian communities. Just a couple images. You'll see here a picture of the handwritten minutes of the first meeting of that committee and the first chairperson, Arthur Dadian, of the committee. This committee met regularly. We have all their minutes in the African Middle Eastern Division archives and organized this effort to collect books, to raise funds, to catalog items in the Library of Congress, and you have already seen in the display some additional items from that committee. This is an image of the committee with the Librarian of Congress. And let's continue. Three of the works on display this evening point to the remarkable role in this regard of the Armenian Catholic Mkhitarist congregation, whose scholarly presses in Venice and Vienna introduced generations of Armenian readers to the history, the religious texts, literature, and geography of Armenians and the wider world. Through their publications, Armenians encountered America on the page before many encountered it as a place of settlement. One early example is the Armenian biography of George Washington, published in Vienna in 1855. Its 7 chapters recount Washington's early life and education, his military career, the American Revolution, his presidency, his return to private life, and his death. The biography closes by quoting Thomas Jefferson's January 2nd, 1814 letter to Walter Jones, written from Monticello. Jefferson described Washington's mind as great and powerful, his judgment as unusually sound, saying that he certainly no general ever planned his battles more judiciously. Jefferson also observed that perhaps the strongest feature in his character was prudence, the habit of not acting until every circumstance and every consideration had been weighed, and then once decided, pursuing his purpose, whatever obstacles opposed. But this is not just a narrative that is glorifying Washington. You see here also, again, Jefferson is quoted, noting that Washington was also slow to adjust when plans changed, for example, that his temper was naturally irritable, and that his public speech could be short and embarrassed. So you have this nuanced portrayal of Washington in this early work. Around the same moment, another vision of America reached Armenian readers. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. It seems like there's a massive mix-up of the items here for some reason. There we go. Published in 1852, appeared in Armenian translation in Venice in 1854, only 2 years after the original. The book had multiple editions, 2 of which are on display tonight. A letter from Harrison Gray Otis Dwight, the American Protestant missionary in Constantinople, captures the astonishment the Armenian translation produced, even among American missionaries. Writing to Professor Kelvin Stowe, Harriet Beecher Stowe's husband, Dwight exclaimed, "Uncle Tom's Cabin in the Armenian language, who would have thought it? I do not suppose your good wife, when she wrote that book, thought that she was going to missionate it among the sons of Haig," a reference to Armenians, "in all their dispersions, following them along the banks of the Euphrates, sitting down with them in their towns and villages under the shade of Hori, Ararat, traveling with them in the wanderings even to India and China. But I have it in my hands, in the Armenian of present day, the same language," remember, this is an American missionary, "the same language in which I speak and think and dream," end quote. Years later, by the way, Harriet Beecher Stowe in a letter expressed her excitement about receiving an Armenian edition of the book. Through this translation, Armenian readers encountered the United States as a society wrestling with slavery, family separation. Editions of the novel continued to circulate in Armenian communities for decades. In 1921, Haigin, the Constantinople-based Armenian women's periodical, presented Stowe as a model of moral courage, literary influence, and female public purpose. The Mkhitarist congregation also nurtured one of the greatest figures in Armenian cartography, Father Elia Endasyan, in Armenian Yeria Endasyan. Working in Venice, he engraved 6 maps between 1784 and 1787 and made an indelible mark on Armenian cartography. His peers described him as a tall, soft-spoken, adroit, and hardworking person. Endasyan engraved a map in 1784 that used the Mercator projection, the first in Armenian cartography. What is striking about Endasyan is how closely he followed the scientific advances of his time. In 1785, less than 2 years after the first manned hot air and hydrogen balloon flights, I'm getting to America, he published an Armenian monograph titled A Brief History of the Gas Balloon. It opened with a full-page engraving of the hydrogen balloon that carried Jacques Charles and Nicolas Louis Robert from Tuileries in Paris to Nez-la-Vallée in 1783. And even included a small map of the balloon's trajectory. The booklet was popular in Constantinople, where 600 copies were sold in only 20 days. That was a bestseller in that time. His map of America, completed in 1787, was part of a 4-map continental set of Africa, America, Asia, and Europe, prepared, as the titles announced, according to new geographic observations. A few hundred copies of these maps were printed over the years, some colored by hand. So in our collection at the library, we have all 4, but the only one that is hand-colored is the America's map, and shipped to Armenian communities across continents for sale. The map on display here comes from that world. Looking closely at the map reveals both the sophistication and the limits of 18th century geographic knowledge. The Atlantic coast, the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, Central America, and much of South America are densely marked. Rivers, coastlines, islands, colonial settlements, and political geographic divisions appear in Armenian script. At the same time, the interior of North America is far less certain. The western and northwestern regions are more schematic. Indigenous peoples and places appear only partially, and usually through the naming habits and territorial assumptions of European cartography of the time. Our journey now turns from imagination to presence, to an Armenian life recorded in America's earliest colonial period. Martin the Armenian is the first recorded Armenian known to have arrived in what is today the United States. He was in Virginia by 1619. This much historians do agree on. In records preserved among the Thomas Jefferson papers in the manuscript division of the Library of Congress, and on display here today for the first time, I do hope that many of you had the opportunity to see it, he appears in 1622 as John Martin the Persian, and in 1623 and 24 as Martin N. Armenian or Martin D. Armenian. So there are several references to him during this period. Martin likely came to Virginia in connection with Governor Sir George Yeardley. By 1619, he had become a freeman, owned 95 acres of land, and cultivated tobacco. In 1622, when he brought tobacco to England, customs officials treated him as a foreigner and tried to charge him doubly duty. Martin petitioned the Virginia Company, arguing that his status in Virginia entitled him to pay the ordinary rate. He won. Afterwards, Martin appears as a member of the Permanent Committee of the Virginia Company in London with the right to vote, although the records indicate that there's some question about his right to vote. His case marks the beginning of the documented Armenian presence in America. Missionary networks helped make America visible and reachable to Armenians before mass migration began. In the 19th century, the Armenian presence in America was still scattered. Students, traders, soldiers, we have soldiers who fought in the Civil War, educators, men whose journeys were often shaped by missionary contacts. One life captures how indirect the path to America could be. In a letter to his brother Kirikor, who had arrived in Boston in 1914, Reverend Asadu Yegoyan wrote from Kharpert, the Ottoman Empire, and I'm quoting here, "Kirikor, you traveled all around the world. Now you know by experience that the world is round. Take care so you will not fall off it." The Reverend's words were not true. At that point, Kirikor had not traveled around the world. He had left the Ottoman Empire, crossed the Atlantic for the United States. This is his ship manifest. But the Reverend's words were indeed prophetic. Kirikor returned to his hometown Kharpert shortly afterward and was caught in World War I. He survived the Armenian genocide with the help of Kurds from Dersim, eventually reached the Caucasus. Conflict in the region then pushed him farther east until he arrived in China. In 1919, he finally boarded a ship to the United States via Japan. By then, he had indeed traveled around the world. This is his journey from the Ottoman Empire all the way to Vladivostok, and then eventually Japan, and from there to the United States, and the corresponding ship manifest. That same year, 1919, Vartan Malcolm published The Armenians in America, an attempt to gather the Armenian American story into a single account. Published in the immediate aftermath of World War I, the book moved from Armenian history, language, religion, and culture to the first Armenians in colonial America, then to immigration, occupations of Armenians here, education, churches, organizations, newspapers, you name it. Here I share a few revealing pages from Malcolm's book. It's about actually marriage and intermarriages in the United States at that point, where he turns from institutions and public life to marriage, matchmaking, and domestic adjustment. Some of the language and assumptions are dated, but the passage is useful nevertheless. It shows how early 20th century Armenian Americans debated belonging, assimilation, and the boundaries of community. He talks, for example, about the fact that he knows a lot of Armenians who have married, Catholic, Jewish Americans, in the community. And then he makes recommendations. He says, this is not for everybody, right? It's a phenomenal couple of pages that are worth looking at. The growth of permanent communities soon found its clearest expression in the building of churches. In February 1890, the trustees of the Armenian community in Worcester resolved to establish a church, and I quote, in order to preserve these immigrants from being alienated, end quote. Within a year, through donations and loans, they purchased land and built the first Armenian church in the United States. This is rather late compared to some other communities, as you can imagine, right? The first synagogues in America appeared a couple centuries earlier. As immigration accelerated in the decades that followed, churches became the institutional heart of Armenian American life, anchoring communities that were still finding their place in the United States while maintaining enduring ties to their religious and cultural heritage. This particular image is from the Prints and Photographs collection at the Library of Congress. It is an image of the first Armenian church in the United States, in Worcester, and next to it is a news report in the Boston Globe about the opening of the church. All right. Things got dark a little bit now. As night fell on Saturday, April 24, 1915, Ottoman Turkish police officers paid surprise visits to dozens of Armenian addresses in Istanbul. Within hours, a who's who of writers, artists, and lay and religious leaders found themselves greeting one another at an unlikely rendezvous spot, the Ottoman capital's central prison. Humidity and dread filled the air, but many were hopeful that they would soon be released. As they lay down to rest that night, they could not have imagined that their journey into darkness had just begun and that it would soon engulf their entire nation. Some 220 Armenian luminaries arrested in the metropolis that night and in subsequent weeks were exiled to the Ottoman Empire's interior. Good fortune and interventions saved a few, the rest were killed. Similar scenes unfolded in cities throughout the empire. That day, April 24, 1915, would mark the beginning of the Armenian genocide, and the day the Armenians commemorate, and globally the Armenian genocide is commemorated April 24 of every year. Across town, the man who had issued the arrest orders was ending his day in a very different setting. Having set the operation in motion, Interior Minister of the Ottoman Empire Talat Pasha, the mastermind of the Armenian genocide, went to dinner with US Ambassador Henry Morgenthau. The letter displayed here, written the same day, that same day, on the Ministry of Interior letterhead, thanks Morgenthau for the invitation, conveys his respects to Mrs. Morgenthau, and assures the ambassador of his most sincere friendship. One survivor of the Armenian genocide was David Atamian. Born in the village of Behesni in 1892 in the Ottoman Empire, Atamian left one of the most extensive Armenian survivor records of the early 20th century. His multi-volume journals, which he donated to the Library of Congress in the 1940s, record deportation, hunger, police persecution, flight, relief work, exile, all 10,000 pages of it, all handwritten in these 14 volumes that you see. So when the Library of Congress received this gift from Atamian in 1947, the Quarterly Journal of Current Acquisitions, which is the official journal of the Library of Congress, called the diary perhaps the most significant, certainly the most unusual acquisition of the year. It described the journals as a valuable source for political history and for understanding Armenian daily life and social conditions in Turkey and northern Syria. Atamian's story continued in America. I'll come back to it. He became an interpreter, writer, an active member of the Armenian American civil and cultural life. This is a couple paragraphs that I want to share with you from his diary that gives you a sense of his experience. He says, "Will I be able to sit here tomorrow?" He's writing on a daily basis, pretty much. "Will I be able to sit here tomorrow at this time, at the head of my table and write? Who knows? Will I be able to sleep here in my bed tomorrow? Where will I be tomorrow, I wonder? It is possible that a gendarme arrests me as a soldier or a policeman as a deportee and sends me to die. But now I'm here, and it is important to take advantage of the silent night and the solitude, the sleepless night, and instead of having nightmares, to write down what is happening, these memories that will be difficult to ever forget." And then there's a section where he loses everybody. He loses his brothers, he loses his father to genocide, most members of his family, except a few that we'll come back to. "Alas, they left," he writes, "and I remained alone, someone who had wished to work for them, to make something of myself, and to share my better days with them." These are some images from his journals. There's also a lot of photographs, documentary records. It's a tremendous resource on the Armenian genocide. Just to give you a sense, I recently submitted a book manuscript for publication, and for 1 week in Aleppo, he has around 200 pages of detailed recording. This is a letter that I would like to share with you, again, because it has relevance to later on in America. His sister is deported. She is sent to a concentration camp in Syria, and she manages to smuggle a letter to him from there. And this is the text of the letter. "Special greetings. I hope you are well. If you ask about us, my brother, I am well, and so is Serpuhi. But because we are in need, she went away for a few days together to sell wood." And she continues on about Serpuhi. "Please send us medication. Veronica is also well." He says, "If you cannot take us all in, at least take Veronica. You will have saved a life. Do whatever you can for us. In any case, send money for the sake of brotherhood, for the sake of God. We have already written to you 6 letters and received no replies. We do not know the reason. If you send money, address it to Hagop Agha Chakmaklian of Bursa. We are under this Agha's tent. He helps us a little, but they too are deportees. Give me news of Annik." And then in parentheses, Atamian says, "This is the girl whom I had taken from her carriage during the deportation." So he saves one member as they're being deported. He saves his niece. Her name is Annik Anna Khanzadian, from the deportation, and takes care of her in hiding in Aleppo for the duration of World War I. Remember Anna Khanzadian. Cultural artifacts can also be survivors. You saw here during the display this evening 3 such examples. The 4 Gospels copied in Jerusalem in 1321, the oldest Armenian manuscript in the Library of Congress. Its later history connects Jerusalem, Van, Harpert, American missionaries, Clifton Springs, New York, and finally Washington, D.C. The Armenian Menologium, produced in Tokat in 1683, tells another story of survival through fragmentation. During the Hamidian massacres in the 1890s, the Bishop of Sivas sold the manuscript. The Bishop of Sivas sold the manuscript in 1909 to raise funds for an orphanage caring for Armenian children left destitute during the Hamidian massacres. So the manuscript was sold during an auction in Paris. It was 560 pages, but it was dispersed. The Library of Congress has 6 pages of it, the 2 of which you just saw. We didn't even know that if there were any other pages that had survived. Recently, a researcher who came as a visiting scholar at the Library of, in our division at the Library of Congress, she discovered a 7th page at a museum in Europe. The library acquired the 6 leaves through a gift by Krikor Minasyan, a prominent Armenian collector of manuscripts from the Middle East and Central Asia. And finally, the 1765 Gospel of John, produced near Constantinople, which entered the collection of Rupen Mamoulian, the Armenian American director who helped transform 20th century stage and cinema. The manuscript was given as a gift to the library by his wife, Azadia Mamoulian, I believe in the time of my predecessor, Dr. Levon Avdoyan. It links Armenian manuscript tradition to Armenian American achievement in the arts. In many ways, the survival of these manuscripts meant being read, researched, and placed within a larger frame here at the Library of Congress. The same movement from inheritance to institution also shaped Armenian American intellectual life. Nina Garsoyan arrived in the United States as a child with her mother. The family photographs, postcard of the ocean liner, the passenger list pamphlet document that passage. She became a leading historian of Armenia and Byzantium, the first woman historian to receive tenure at Columbia University in 1969, the first holder of the Gevorg Avedisian Chair in Armenian History and Civilization at Columbia, and later the first woman to serve as Dean of Princeton University's Graduate School. The library's African and Middle Eastern division now holds her archives, including lectures, correspondence, research notes, and materials documenting her scholarly career and the growth of Armenian studies in the United States. By 1976, Armenian Americans were no longer only telling stories of arrival, refuge, survival. In this bicentennial issue of Kermanig, the publication of Marash Armenians, any Armenians who have connections to Marash here? The quarterly of the Union of Marash Armenians, the descendants of Marash, used America's 200th anniversary to place themselves inside a national story. The publication, this specific issue is in Armenian, English, and Spanish. The issue begins with America, freedom, and the earliest traces of Armenians in the world, but its real force lies in the gallery of lives that follows. These are Armenians from specifically the town of Marash, who ended up in the United States, and celebrating its history and their contribution to its history. Now, I want to go back to Atamian. Near the end of his life, Atamian began writing a memory book of his native village of Behesni. Memory books were part of a literary genre that emerges after the Armenian genocide, where survivors publish books documenting life, customs, culture in their ancestral villages in an effort to recreate that, salvage that memory away from their ancestral lands, right, and pass it on to the next generation. We have a similar tradition with, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, by the way, with the Yiskor books, right? He described the town, so Atamian, the Atamian we encountered earlier, describes the town in his English language manuscript in extraordinary detail. The steep valley, the stone bridges, the Armenian quarter, the roofs where children played and families slept in the summer, the severe winters, the springs controlled by the Turkish quarter, the caravanserais, the markets, the churches, stories of his mother, and the house of his childhood. And then the manuscript stops. He ends the second chapter with a simple line. Next chapter, fruits and flowers of Behesni. He never wrote it. This is Atamian's death certificate. He died in Arlington Hospital on October 26, 1978. His niece was the informant. He died alone. There was only one person with him. She was taking care of him that entire time. I had the good fortune of interviewing several people who knew him in that period. There was one person next to him. It was his niece, and the death certificate identifies her name, Anna Khanzadian. That little girl he saved in Aleppo on the deportation route during the Armenian genocide. He returned the favor more than 60 years later by standing by his deathbed. Many of you saw David Atamian's poetry book that was published, and it was on display, which received glowing reviews. After coming to the United States, he becomes an interpreter for the State Department. He was a federal employee his entire life, well, at least in the latter period of his life. He becomes an interpreter for the State Department. He always in his diaries wished he could learn other languages. He was very fluent in Ottoman. He wrote poetry in Ottoman Turkish. His journals include a lot of Ottoman poetry in Ottoman Turkish. He also expressed interest and wish to learn Farsi, French, and he said, I wish I can learn these languages. Guess what? When you read his obituary in the Washington Post, he was the translator for the State Department for Armenian, Turkish, Farsi, French, and the languages are listed. So he did learn those languages. He also wrote poetry, and his poetry was published in the Washington Post and the New York Times, and eventually appears in a book. It's called Mountain of the Moon and Other Poems. So I do not know what David Atamian was thinking in those final hours of his life. But I would like to think that somewhere in him, the unwritten chapter was still there. The fruits and flowers of Behesni. The lost town returning not as a wind, but as spring. And so I want to share with you a poem from that collection. Under the blue sky, the snow on the mountain melts, and in cool torrents rushes down the colorful gardens. The almond, apple, and pear are in bloom, and the sweet scent of pistachio clusters fills the air. The plum and apricot grows beside the mulberry and twine their flower-laden branches with Neapolitan medlars. Pomegranate trees in silky green vestments nod bell-like blossoms over the vineyard hedges. Above them, the swallows and cranes fly north to their summer homes, while under their feet, tulips, violets, and serapias and blue narcissus carpet the ground. It is spring in Behesni. What these materials show is that there was never just one Armenian America. There were many Armenias carried into America and vice versa. America was a place of study, work, reinvention, public life, and refuge. It is also the place where inherited trauma, political loyalties, language, religion, and ordinary American life had to be negotiated across generations. The migration scholars often speak of push and pull, the forces that drive people from one place and forces that draw them to another. As we saw, Armenian migration to America was shaped by both. Their America was a mixture of preservation and transformation. In Watertown, Whitensville, Worcester, Fresno, New York, Detroit, Providence, Racine, Los Angeles, and elsewhere, Armenians rebuilt fragments of the worlds they had lost. A town in Massachusetts could become, for a child growing up there, a kind of homeland. A church register could preserve the name of a village that had vanished from maps. A school book could carry the fear that children might one day forget the language. America also changed them. Children learned English, names shifted, some became absorbed in American life almost completely. Others returned to Armenian identity later through genealogy, church records, photographs, recipes, songs, and the sudden discovery of a family story. This too is part of the Armenian American experience. Not a clean line from old world to new, but a constant movement between inheritance and change. There is much in this history that may seem some of us as distinctively Armenian. But Armenian Americans also shared much with other immigrant communities. They faced questions familiar across American history. How to preserve without freezing, how to change without disappearing, how to raise children between languages, how to endure suspicion, to become American without making ancestry feel like a burden. As we mark 250 years of the United States, these collections remind us that American history is made by founding documents, yes, national monuments, yes, but also by the communities that bring their pasts into public keeping. I'd like to conclude with a personal experience. As I was working on this talk, I remembered my own, I was thinking about my own journey, and I remembered my first day at the Library of Congress. This was during the pandemic, this was during COVID, and the library was closed. I came here to pick up my laptop. It was also the first day I visited what is referred to in the African Middle Eastern Division as the cage, which is where our rare materials are housed, many of which you saw today. And that is where, for the first time, I was in the presence of this tremendous wealth, this tremendous collection that was collected, curated, prepared over decades. And it was a very overwhelming feeling. This realization that there are so many people who have called America home, including the Armenian community in Washington, D.C., that have over the decades helped make that collection what it is today. So as we reflect on the next 250 years, I look at us all as those who are going to continue on preserving, studying, exploring our cultural heritage of today, and passing it on to the next generation. Thank you very much.